Sohrab Ahmari is an Iranian-American columnist, editor, and author of nonfiction books. He is currently the op-ed editor of the New York Post and a contributing editor to the Catholic Herald. In January 2019, Ignatius Press published his spiritual memoir, From Fire by Water, about his conversion to Roman Catholicism. He is at work on a book exploring 12 fundamental questions our culture doesn't ask. I'm so pleased to have Sohrab with us now, and so we'll begin. So, Sohrab, I understand that the specific questions are embargoed by you and your publisher, I understand. But perhaps you can explain or establish the framing device for us. In other words, what are the stakes for these questions? Why don't we ask these questions? What do asking these questions challenge us to consider? And maybe what are the risks for not asking these questions?
Thanks for having me, Cale. And sorry I couldn't join everyone at the Abbey in person. Hopefully next year we could do that. So the book, and I appreciate you asking that, the book is a book of 12 questions, each of them explored through the life of a great thinker from many different traditions, Jewish, Catholic, Protestant, pagan. And the impetus for writing it was really my own entrance into fatherhood. I now have 2 children. But when I started writing it, or proposing it, I only had one, and he's a son of mine. And, you know, in some ways, my wife and I, the very fact that we're married and living together and have this child is a product of liberal modernity's barrier dissolving impulses. So I'm Iranian American, she's Chinese, but we met in America. It's a kind of only in America type of story. Right. And I can't have anything but gratitude as an immigrant to the United States. Nevertheless, no amount of gratitude can allay or alleviate the concerns that I have about what kind of creature our contemporary culture, with its emphasis on just maximizing individual autonomy and overcoming all sorts of barriers that bound traditional societies. If that's the only emphasis of a civilization, then I'm worried what kind of a man our culture would chisel out of my son. So I had this urge to tell him some things, but I figured that as Pope Benedict recounting Kierkegaard's famous allegory of the clown who comes to a modern village and wants to warn them of a fire, he's the man of faith. But of course, because he's dressed like a clown, they just think it's part of his act. And by the time the fire reaches the village, it's too late. And both the village and the circus burned down. So I felt that I couldn't just, shout like the clown. So I had to be more strategic in terms of trying to set up a different way of thinking for my son, or guide him to a different way of thinking, and to help him to get over what C.S. Lewis called chronological snobbery, that sense that I had when I was, young, where you think that the best ideas must also be the newest, the truest claims must also be the latest ones. And so how do I do that? I did it by posing provocative questions that some of them would be familiar to the attendees, but I think for our wider culture, to frame them in the form of questions and then to explore them through the lives of great thinkers was one way to satisfy my own sort of paternal concern for my son. And the last thing I would say is that, obviously, as you know, I'm a journalist. I'm not a theologian. I'm not a philosopher. And the book is not a book of original scholarship in philosophy or theology. I claim no pretense to originality. All I'm doing is trying to transmit and telling the story of ideas and of the men and women who brought forth these ideas.
That's great. Yeah, I just today I had my last class with my humanities students, and we were asking them, sort of actually using a Lewis question from the Screwtape Letters, have you read anything this year that struck you as true? And it was really interesting getting the feedback from the kids, because like you and me, when we were going through our own intellectual journey, I certainly suffered from recency bias. I'm smarter than anybody who lived in the 1600s, say, because I live in, I used to joke, like, come on, it's the 90s, and yet, you read, Pascal, and he's writing in the 17th century, and you're checking the date on the book because you can't believe that he's asking these questions, he's posing these challenges to me, and this is what a friend of mine should say to me. I can't believe that he did it, all the way back then. So I love it, asking these questions. It doesn't matter if it's original, but the frame is original, and that's why I'm really intrigued with your concept of play. And so, can you tell us a little bit about this idea of play and how you connect it with the good Rabbi Heschel and this notion of Sabbath?
So one of the questions, the one we can explore here briefly in the book, is why does God want you to play? And of course, the use of play there is twofold, in the sense that Americans divide their lives between work and play. Right. But as you also know, anthropologists of religion, including someone like Gardini, who's not an anthropologist, but nevertheless thinks about religion and liturgy in an anthropological way, would say that the closest secular approximation to what happens in liturgical action or in worship is child's play, in the sense that it's an activity that's done for its own sake, not for, it fulfills other social functions, but it's mainly done for its own sake of propitiating the divine, and that it's an activity where various objects come to symbolize things outside themselves. So, if you go to a Muslim mosque, the vaults in the mosque stand for the vaults of heaven. Right. It's not just vaults, and so, or anyway, all sorts of other examples you can think of where, when we Catholics go to Mass, things don't stand in for themselves, right? The action of beating your chest 3 times is purely a kind of symbolic action, and yet it expresses our own sense of uneasiness with what we've done during the week, and then it unites it into a kind of objective message, our subjective feeling, into an objective message about how the world really works. Yeah. So I'm paraphrasing and really abridging this idea of liturgy and worship as divine play. And the chapter that you mentioned asks, why does God want you to play? And I mean that in both the sense of, why does he want you to rest and not work on work things all the time? And to do it specifically in this divinely ordained play that's not quite the same as binging on Netflix and takeout for 18 hours.
Why then the Sabbath, and what's the risk of losing the Sabbath?
So, as again most attendees know, Abraham Joshua Heschel was born into a family of Hasidic royalty in Poland. But then, as he grew up, and he was brilliant, and he memorized all the things you're supposed to memorize as a young would-be Rebbe. He memorized them, when he was like 9 years old. Far sooner than he was. So he was destined to be a Rebbe, and he was. But as he grew older, he began to have inclinations toward philosophy, to try to articulate a philosophy of religion that resisted the tendencies of the sort of German 1920s and 30s, when the claims in scripture or the claims of religion generally were only treated as not whether these things are true or what do they say that is true about God or about humankind, but to treat them as merely artifacts of a Near Eastern civilization, and what is examining these artifacts through the lens of either literary criticism or historical analysis reveal about those civilizations. But he wanted to say, no, this has a prophetic message for our time. And among his many areas of interest was the Sabbath. And one notable fact about his own experience was that he's in Germany. He's studying for his philosophy PhD at the University of Berlin. Then he's trying to get his dissertation published, which was a requirement at the time to earn your doctorate. And meanwhile, the Nazis take over. And when do they stage their first anti-Jewish boycott? When the brown shirts blocked Jewish businesses and attacked Jewish business owners and so forth. It happened on a Saturday,
of course,
on the Sabbath. And so he makes this argument that sort of Sabbathless, restless societies, playless societies, are somehow monstrous because when people don't give God his rest, they don't give each other a rest. And it's a very beautiful, beautiful image. And I think obviously it has resonance for our time, because we live at a time when everyone is constantly plugged in and working, and we don't give each other a rest. We don't give nature a rest. We don't give our employees a rest. And I'm not sure if the tendency toward online work now will make that any better. I think there's a risk that it'll make it worse. So Pope Benedict makes this beautiful point, which would resonate. It's bizarre to read Pope Benedict and Heschel at the same time, and I do the book, and yet it's so revealing, because Pope Benedict makes this point. I think this is writing as Cardinal Ratzinger, about the story of Exodus. I think if you ask most people, even biblically literate people, I dare say, if you ask, what is it that God through Moses demands of Pharaoh? People would say, let my people go so they could have their own freedom or their own country. But that's not what, right? As you know, it's not what God asks. He asks, let my people go so they can serve me.
Yeah. Just this year, I just reread Exodus a month ago.
Right.
Not that I'm but I struck by that exact point. He just wants them to be able to go out and offer the proper
liturgical worship. Right.
Yeah. And it sounded to me, again, from Exodus, that they were going to come right back. Yeah, it wasn't going to be this big break. It was rather, hey, they need this day of rest.
So Pope Benedict makes the point that Israel's liturgical liberation prefigures its political liberation. It's coming to the land of Israel, and I think that's just a beautiful image for what would. Sabbath restrictions, generally liturgical actions, why we don't just worship as we please, but follow certain rhythms and rules and rituals, how that's bound up with political freedom, social freedom, but also, more importantly, interior freedom.
So you and I are both Catholic, and we come from a liturgical tradition. Yet I get the sneaking sense from talking with you and reading your work that you're worried. You're worried about our connection to the Sabbath as practicing Catholics. And so I wonder if you could maybe talk a little bit about that the role that the Sabbath should play for us as Catholics, as practicing Catholics.
Well, I'll take it. I'll mention it very personally. I mean, especially these past 2-3 months, the lines between work and Sabbath have been so blurred. Just literally the spaces we inhabit are now all on top of each other. And it seems to me that that's accelerating a process that was underway before the coronavirus pandemic, which is, again, this dissolving of barriers, where you work for 5 days and then you stop, and then you spend time with family, with the things of God, with good books. And so I think, as a personal matter, I worry about that in my own life, but also as a civilizational matter. I think that there is a role for how we shape the rhythm of our lives, socially, politically, economically, and how much time and attention we can give to God. So I think there's a political project in the chapter you're talking about, in the sense that, it is unfortunate that most recently, just I think in 2017, I want to say, maybe 2018, the last blue law, the last sort of Sunday trading ban in the United States as a statewide matter was overturned in South Dakota by the legislature, by a Republican legislature.
I believe it was a year ago in March. I believe it was 2018
okay.
March. Yeah.
There we go. Yeah, it's in the chapter. I'm now forgetting but and I think, look, you could say it's because people have become less religious, and so we should just give everyone choice to work as much as they want. But you could also say we're becoming less religious because the way we organize society doesn't provide the time and space we need for liturgical action, for meditation. And so that at that point, the argument of the chapter takes a political turn, saying, should we, Christians, Jews, Muslims, all people of faith, begin to insist that, especially people on the lower rungs, working class people, need time with family and need time with God.
And sort of maybe going back to Rabbi Heschel, what can you talk a little bit about how he frames it with time and space, and that the Sabbath is a sort of a preservation of time, maybe space. So go ahead.
That's one of his beautiful concepts in this book called The Sabbath, where he says most of human activity is concerned with conquest of space, building great things, raising up armies, taking over geographic space, and even turning time into a commodity, which becomes then a kind of spatial thing that can achieve things in space. But the Sabbath, he argues, is this opening up of eternity and an act of preserving the imperative of time in our sort of otherwise space-obsessed civilization. That the Sabbath opens up this other dimension in which you're not trying to conquer space, in which you are not trying to economically best your fellow human being, in which you're not trying to subdue nature, but you're just trying to be.
Well, Sohrab, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much for carving out some time. Welcome back to the office for you.
Yes.
And I'm really looking forward to reading your 12 questions book.
Oh, thank you.